Playing with Homo Ludens, a review of Homo Ludens, a study of the play element of culture from the 2014 Martino Publishing reprint of 1950 Roy Publishers edition with unnamed translator. Given my goal with this writing, to provide a chronological summary overview of the philosophy of play and games, you may be disappointed that this shall not be a chapter analysis of Johann Huizinga's beliefs and insights. I will instead endeavor to provide an understanding for those who, 1. do not wish to read Homo Ludens themselves, or 2. have read Homo Ludens, yet feel at a loss for a takeaway, yet still wish to place Homo Ludens and its influence in time. I must admit that my first introduction to Johann Huizinga's philosophy was for its presence within video game auteur Hideo Kojima's game Death Stranding. Kojima achieved worldwide renown for the video game series Metal Gear Solid, the story of which was, in the world of artistic critique or analysis of games, hailed for its uncanny and prolific depiction of war and politics in the information age. Everything from the rise of memes' influence on culture and disinformation to predicting the hypocritical slogan of "Make America Great Again" with the villainous character Senator Armstrong just 2 years before then-candidate Donald Trump would adopt the campaign slogan, the context of which in the game was indeed removed to create pro-Trump memes. A portion of Death Stranding was dedicated to expanding on Johann Huizinga's ideas of play and games developing into culture and relating it to the game's core themes of building social connection when the age of modernity breeds isolation. Outside games themselves, Johann Huizinga finds it prudent to look at play in isolation from games. He calls on commentaries by Plato to inform his own Platonic framework, thus positions his book as an intersectional expression of anthropology and philosophy. The bridges his analysis provides are what centers this philosophy of play to how it impacts the broader theater of humanity and games. With that note of respect and admiration past, my analysis style is not particularly charitable. We will also see the ripples of Johann Huizinga's influence with the play element called the magic circle. The term has become essential to the common parlance of games scholarship and will be the central focus of a future video with a book of the same name by J. Klabbers. Now, without further stalling for signposts, let us discuss Johann Huizinga's philosophy of play. Huizinga's ontology of play. Like many who have tackled the task of analyzing play from a philosophical perspective, Huizinga has taken a categorical approach to defining play. He creates a list of categories that are characteristics of play, characteristics that are drawn from observing people playing directly. I say people here because one of Huizinga's best insights for his methods is not limiting the understanding of play to children specifically, as so many academics do to this day. These characteristics are not presented in a precise format. They are not written as a list, nor is it explicitly stated what characteristics are more prominent or important. It is never stated what characteristics are independently sufficient to give rise to play, nor if nor which of the characteristics are jointly sufficient to give rise to play. As such, it becomes the reader's work to create this list and glean from context what characteristic is being channeled when Huizinga uses the catch-all term play element. This becomes important to a close reading of Homo Ludens, as most of the work is dedicated to acknowledging these characteristics as present in various aspects of culture, to thus demonstrate that cultural touchstones historically arose out of the activity of play. The case is well made via extensive inductive argument. For now, I will make this work easier by presenting that list of characteristics in order of frequency referenced. Agonistic, meaning involving movement. Ritualistic, meaning requiring limited expression, prescribed expectations, or role-playing, which we may see as an understanding of rules in a context of a philosophy of games. Competitive, meaning contests where the purpose is to win. The magic circle, meaning distinct from the social norm, there is a social contract to engage in play and agree to the logic of that play. Creative, meaning the innovation of developing skills and creating an art object. Multi-teleological, meaning used toward multiple purposes and ends, including those that may be serious, non-whimsical, or non-fun ends. Sans teleological, meaning it can be without external purpose, it is done for its own sake. Platonic episteme, meaning play is an esoteric connection to an expression of the Platonic form of the intellect. Thus, it is the spiritual means by which humanity creates knowledge. With a cursory glance at these characteristics, you will assuredly see some odd priorities and inconsistencies. Before commenting on these, it is more prudent to now look at Huizinga's analytical method. Huizinga's analysis method. Here I will describe Huizinga's analysis styles in the order of priority given. I will, in this section, provide some explanation of how these styles are expressed as we proceed. First, the linguistic analysis. Huizinga treats etymology as a historical record of how cultures think of the concept of play. Huizinga also occasionally slips into treating language as a causal record that reveals the metaphysical secret nature of a thing. It is often unclear which is being employed at a given moment. Likely both are maintained as running postulates regardless. The difficulty with this view of language is that it must presuppose that language grows and changes denotatively, such that in any instance that a language's use of its word play, or the root of its word for play, occurs, the conclusion becomes that the culture must also conceive of that second concept as also related to, or that of, play, the activity itself. Language is not so Spartan as to behave in this way. Sometimes words are used to refer to another thing that is different as a term of art. Sometimes words are made in juxtaposition to their historical meaning in order to literally, virtually, emphasize the opposite meaning. This is called a contronym. Sometimes a word may be used to refer to a second concept because it sounds alike in a neighboring culture's language, or because a written symbol for a word looks similar to the symbol for another word. This happens rather frequently in Japan's usage of Chinese characters in its writing system. Despite Chinese and Japanese being drastically different grammatical languages, language is living, it is messy, it need not keep usage nor concepts consistent through time. Here there is a fundamental flaw with how etymology is used as an analytical tool. To salvage its usage, we must not assume the links to be accurately portrayed. Instead, we would need to look at each instance to see if the etymology referenced is corroborated by the cultural context. Huizinga's semantic exploration is often first prescriptive rather than descriptive, first by laying out the play concept in the abstract, then exploring languages for confirmations of that concept. That is quite plainly confirmation bias. Yet to his credit, and in spite of living in the colonialist disparagement of referring to many cultures as savages, he draws from languages across every continent. He takes every language's characteristics with equal respect. He attempts to fairly expose when a language's word for play does not coincide with his concepts, though rare. Huizinga's study of language far exceeds my own, but my own study of Japanese leads me to critiquing a specific instance in the manner I alluded to previously. Against his credit, he draws on the Japanese language with something called asobi kotoba. Those two words specifically mean play and words, then goes on to describe the term as referring to a social practice of Japanese nobility to describe their peers' deceased relatives as merely playing dead in conversation. This is something I have never witnessed discussed in my entire education in Asian and Pacific Islander cultural studies, nor in studying Japanese language, nor have I seen it expressed in classical or period piece media. Huizinga did not do us the favor of telling us which era of Japanese history a specific clan of samurai, if nobility is in reference to the merchant class or the emperor's family. Essentially, he did not provide nearly enough information for someone like myself to research the claim. The only reference to asobi kotoba I could find through a cursory Google search were direct quotations of Huizinga himself and a podcast which plagiarized Homo Ludens. In light of this, I can only assume that this was likely some misinformation spreading through the Netherlands at the time. I would gladly be proven wrong. This is not surprising given the open yet problematic position Huizinga has between colonialism and scholarship. He frequently makes use of the language of supremacy, deriding large parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas as savages. However, Huizinga also lauds ancient Indian and Egyptian culture as advanced and superior. Huizinga appears to be trapped between wanting to be culturally versed, yet in an environment where the language of academia was itself bound up in power dynamics and bigotry. It is likely that other such mistakes, born of confirmation bias, will stick out to people who have experience with other cultures. Regardless, linguistic analysis is merely Huizinga's first method. Let us move on to the next method that rounds out Huizinga's case. Second, historical analysis. This makes up the bulk of Huizinga's argument, and for good measure. This is also the aspect of Huizinga's writing that is most convincing, going through specific cultural activities throughout time, while highlighting how cultural practices that were explicitly playful eventually become more complex versions of the practices entrenched in social systems that define the culture. In doing this, Huizinga not only overcomes other shortcomings in his method through an abundance of inductive evidence exposing characteristics of play, he may also establish as causal chains that activities once considered play by a prior culture become seen as social and religious norms that are no longer considered play. Of particular interest to me was the chapter on the play element in law. The inductive argument presented in this method over the course of the book was sufficient to convince me of the conclusion that play is the fundamental human activity that begins the creation of culture. So much so that I must disagree with Huizinga's opening assertion that not all culture arises from play. There is little room left in Homo Ludens for anything of culture to not be the result of play. Whilst always related to the historical analysis, it will be helpful to distinguish the third method as distinct. Third, personal observation method. Once Huizinga establishes the characteristics of the play element, anything holding even one characteristic is given the moniker of play element. The challenge here is that while at first glance it seems fair to move from characteristic to play element to thing is play, these jumps contain within them a fairly basic logical faux pas, one that will, as it was left unchecked, give way to a point change fallacy in the last two chapters of the piece. This initial fallacy being a misapplication of the statement all A are B, a basic symbolic logic lesson. A valid logical form is all A are B, given A, therefore B. First example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Second example, all Catholics are Christians, I am a Catholic, therefore I am a Christian. An invalid logical form is all A are B, given B, therefore A. The relationship between A and B breaks down because even though all A may be B, this alone cannot prove that all B are also A. Such would only be the case if the logical statement was a direct tautology, like A is B, B is A. But let us provide some practical examples for illustration regardless. First invalid example. All men are mortal. A bird is mortal. Therefore, a bird is a man. Second invalid example. All Catholics are Christian. I am Christian. Therefore, I am also a Catholic. Note for readers from non-Christian cultures, many sects of Christianity exist and not all sects are the single sect of Catholicism. Can you see the logical faux pas at play? Huizinga's mistake is a slightly more advanced version of the same mistake. The observational reasoning goes something like this. Play has the quality of ritual. Religions have the quality of ritual. Therefore, religion is play. Example 2. Sean has red hair. Peter has red hair. Therefore, Peter is Sean. To abstract the form, all A is B, all C is B, given B, therefore, all C is A. In other words, two B therefore A fallacies are used as the basis for a false equivalency. The challenging part of pointing out this faux pas is that pointing out the flaw in reasoning does not automatically make the conclusion false. I am not about to commit the cheekily named fallacy right now. Religion could still maintain the play element, and I believe Huizinga's historical method maintains the conclusion. Yet as Huizinga continues to apply this faux pas when attempting to analyze cultural phenomena, he will never have an occasion to not attribute the play element to everything. As his fourth analytical method bleeds through the final chapters, Huizinga progressively calls more modern cultural forms as being bad or worse than their predecessors. He will then attribute to this reduction in quality to a reduction in the presence of the play element, an assertion that lacks any support from his three previous methods. Fourth, cultural and political pessimism. With increasing frequency as the book nears its end, Huizinga expresses a broad belief that humanity is in a state of cultural decay. This was not an uncommon belief in the 20th century in general, as the inherent violence of colonialism reached its fever pitch once empowered by industrialization. To escalate the frequency and severity of wars abroad and political conflicts domestic on a newly globalized scale. I would never say that Huizinga's beliefs were unfounded, yet the manner of the complaints and the majority of his chosen boogeymen come off as the typical dismissive attitude of every generation to their youngers. Complaints around the size and shape of women's clothing, the best number of people to dance with, and of how terrible the Romans were compared to the Greeks do not inherently share the page well with legitimate concerns of the propaganda machines of Nazi fascist dictatorships and Soviet Russia. In the final two chapters, Huizinga applies a cultural and political pessimist analysis, a foundational belief that worldwide culture is degrading for lacking in the play element. Yet he fails to demonstrate this outside of expressing his own personal preferences with regards to art, fashion, and entertainment. The only justification given in every case for why these new cultural practices are worse is that they are lacking in the play element. Here, Huizinga assumes the conclusion, while relying on the frequency of the statement to bolster the case. Rather than using perceived degradation of aspects of culture as a preface to the conclusion that they are lacking in the generic reference to a play element, Huizinga ought to have presented how he concludes those cultural aspects have degraded by naming the characteristics of play in specific and demonstrating how the aspects are diminished as premises. Without doing this, each criticism of an aspect of culture comes across as begging the question without deeper consideration. In the final chapter, Huizinga has almost entirely left discussion of play itself for a political critique of the global theater. Particularly, he is angered by the excessive demonstrations of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. I too have a significant hatred for nationalistic fascism of any appearance or rhetoric. Huizinga also takes issue with the United States for its increasingly entrenched two-party systems. Again, a point that I agree with. I would even go so far as to say that our two-party system has, in the 21st century, given way to one party tacitly accepting the rise of nationalistic fascism. Yet these critiques, while they would be valid and interesting in a work dedicated to political philosophy, was instead forced to fit into this framework of play giving rise to culture. Huizinga wants to maintain an unstated premise that the qualities of play, each characteristic of the play element, must also be of the good, that tacitly we should think all play is fun and joyful, thus worth celebrating. Insofar as play must be good, Huizinga coined a term for its inverse as puralism. Puralism is defined as mimicry of the play element, yet taken wholly seriously, devoid of mirth or humor. Yet Huizinga does not account for how something can have the characteristics of play while also not being play. His first method relates things unlike play to play through language. His second method relates things unlike play to play through historical inheritance. His third method relates things unlike play to play through observing the characteristics directly. At least within the text of Homo Ludens, Huizinga has established no means by which to decide something that is like play is not play in fact. Huizinga even contradicts his own statements by juxtaposing pluralism as serious when he also advocated that play may be taken quite seriously by a culture and retain its status as play. What has resulted is a no true Scotsman fallacy. Within the text, we can only conclude that pluralism is in fact play, even as that play is considered bad. Taking Huizinga's philosophy of play forward, over the course of Homo Ludens, the philosophical image of play presented by Huizinga is inconsistent and progressively simplified. Huizinga originally asserts that not all aspects of culture arise from play, yet chapters 3 through 10 gradually assert that all cultures arise from play. He asserts that play is not limited to the agonistic characteristic of play, but as Huizinga applies the term play element with greater and greater frequency, it comes to mean agonist and competitive to the detriment of all other characteristics. Huizinga at once wants to hold that most aspects of culture which one would take seriously maintain their aspects of play, as well as that seriousness and earnestness are the antithesis of play. Yet, failing to spend a length of time to exploring when play ceases to be play, Huizinga intentionally creates an exception without a difference. Pluralism becomes a pejorative for that which appears to be play, yet is in fact wholly serious, but not serious nor earnest in the way that is good for good cultural playthings. So let us tackle that question directly. When does a cultural expression of a play element cease to be play? To wit, I will put forward two possibilities that may be contained within Huizinga's philosophy, and two which require bringing in something external. Let us assume that play ceases when the characteristic of ritual is violated. Ritual is when play conforms to a certain kind of expression or a certain set of actions, when a dance requires specific moves at a predetermined rhythm, when boxers agree to touch their gloves before the match begins, or even when they adhere to striking only with their hands. The characteristic of ritual is highly related to the characteristic of the magic circle, whereas the magic circle is the agreement to enter into a play apart from the norm. Ritual is the shape and the form of the play. Rituals are the rules that govern play as it grows into imaginative role play, into sport, and into games. This is how we know that the adoption of ritual does not cause play to cease. What then of an established ritual? If the ritual ends or is ignored, does the play end? That particular instance of play most assuredly is over, but only insofar as the game has been spoiled. Yet it would be more appropriate to say change to the established ritual is equivalent to the adoption of a new ritual in the same context. If any change to how the game is played, or the reinvention of a ritual or custom, destroyed the inheritance of the play element, then culture will never grow, nor would it be able to maintain the play element as a matter of historical analysis. We must instead accept that play persists even as rules and rituals change, unless we would rather believe play to be some primordial source of inspiration only available to the very first humans. Let us try to avoid magical explanations like this. Let us now assume that play ceases when the characteristic of the magic circle is violated. The magic circle has two prime aspects. First, an agreement, social contract, or consent to participate. And second, that it establishes a space outside the bounds of normal expression, that the standard rules of regular society do not apply, but only to the extent implied by the consent aspect. Like with ritual, violation of the magic circle in any specific instance simply spoils the group's enjoyment of one play session. If someone withdraws their consent, they return to the social norm. They exit the magic circle. Another form is when one attempts to change the agreement of the circle for everyone, when they attempt to change the ritual. If they consent, a new play begins. If they do not, then the current play resumes. Should one insist on a change that will not be consented to, the one may find themselves ousted by the magic circle of players. From an individual play perspective, violation of the magic circle appears to be replaced by nothing. This is likely because the alternative of the normal social life is always present. Yet if we are to take seriously the idea that culture arises from play, we should see the established norm for what it is: another play. its own magic circle and ritual, one that has grown all-encompassing over a certain region of human life. To this extent, Homo Ludens offers us an expansion on social contract political philosophy. It creates an account for how the contract is formed and why people newly born are assumed into the contract before being afforded the opportunity and mental capacity to consent. This will be one possible, real change to see when play is no longer play. On the individual level, when the magic circle is exited, the play ends. However, should the play activity grow so large within a culture such that one's consent is assumed at birth, then it is no longer a magic circle, it is a social norm. The prime aspect of the space outside of normal expression in society cannot be maintained if that space subsumes the first prime aspect. The two aspects are jointly necessary to give rise to the characteristic of the magic circle, even if the activity retains the other characteristics of play, the ritual, the contest, the creation, etc. It is unlikely to be seen as play by the culture. However, this does not address our issue of pluralism. We have answered when play ceases to be play, essentially when ludens becomes polis, yet not when something masquerades as play and is instead bad play. Let us try again. Now I will move on to attempting to define pluralism using ideas from outside of Homo Ludens. Rather than focusing on the cessation of the play, we can instead focus on the badness of pluralism. We can focus on the unethical dimension. I would like to apply one simple ethical rule called the harm principle here. The harm principle establishes that an act is bad if it causes real harm to a person. I choose this ethical rule first for its intuitiveness, and second because in the modern culture of play, extensive efforts are usually made to prevent even incidental harm. In baseball and American football, armor is worn in the form of helmets and pads. In gymnastics and professional wrestling, foams and canvased flooring are used that have compression and give to absorb the impacts on the floor. In boxing, people wear thick, heavy gloves to protect their hands, though there is good evidence to say gloves cause more injury. Beyond physical sports, tabletop role-play games have formally adopted more and more safety tools to establish a safe space for mental health. Session 0 is a planning session for a game to decide what kind of story the table will tell. Thus, they make the consent aspect of the magic circle explicit. Other tools for avoiding mental, emotional, and social harms. The X card to allow players to non-verbally interrupt a potentially trauma-triggering course of events. Lines and veils to establish topics beforehand that are either off-limits as well as ones that are challenging yet willing to be explored. And roses and thorns, where a discussion after a game is used to establish the best and worst moments of the session while improving player comfort. Avoiding harm is quite normal for games. However, games are also known to make fun out of doing harm. In my teen years, plenty of pastime games ranging from the quaint to the idiotic filled our days. Playing with paper footballs often resulted in kids getting hit in the eye. A game we called Quarters was simply about flicking coins at each other's knuckles on a table until bloodied. Some boys would even trade kicking each other in their crotches to prove their toughness to each other. Anyone who has watched a pirate movie knows the game of stabbing a knife between your fingers at a speed. And what mobster film would be complete without Russian roulette? Heck, even regular gambling inherently has the harm of losing one's wealth. Some play is harmful by design, as the harm can establish the stakes and the excitement, and is only retained as play through the consent of the magic circle. It is perhaps nobler to only pursue forms of play that do not intrinsically cause harm. We could, in fact, stop here and say any play or game that causes harm is pluralist. Yet, to that I would say we cast a wide net in a smaller pond. We bring rather mundane examples of harm into the pluralist category without consideration of consent, which in turn discredits any future attempt to categorize great harms as pluralist when we would want to make a distinction. For example, by saying one may not rationally consent to such great harms, even with the harm principle, we may come across another point change fallacy to this mystery of pluralism. So let us try once more. This time I will allow some self-indulgence by applying my own definition of play from my work Controller Revolution, Why Video Games Are the Future of Philosophy, in which I take quite some time to arrive at what I hope is a simple yet all-encompassing definition of play: learning through experimental engagement. I will not be rehashing the specifics of this definition here, rather I would like to put my definition in conversation with Huizinga's characteristics of play, and its function of creating culture. In particular, I find agreement with the function of creating culture, as when a person seeks to apply what they have learned, they would naturally need to involve others in their play, to engage others in what they have learned. Perhaps this is where my conflict with Huizinga's concept of play begins. Huizinga appeals to the epistemology of Plato to both open and close Homo Ludens. The relationship between play and Plato's form of the intellect seek to connect play to knowledge through esoteric spirit. We see little appeal to Platonism or learning throughout the body of Homo Ludens. This leads me to question whether Huizinga took this connection seriously, or if the appeals to ancient philosophy were made with the interest of inspiration and poetics. Regardless, my definition elevates Huizinga's Platonic sense to the forefront. However, we need not appeal to the spiritual. Through observation, a willingness to experience possibilities, and pursuing those possibilities eagerly, the rational faculty of the human brain can both recognize and create the patterns which we call learning. If the first and inherent quality of play is our intuitive capacity to learn, then the rest of Huizinga's characteristics of play can arise as expressions of that learning. Those expressions, as they spread throughout humanity, give rise to culture. Those cultural inventions can, of course, retain the play element, the learning through experimental engagement that allows cultures to develop and change. This will give us a new avenue for defining a difference between play and pluralism. If the inherent character of the play element is a form of learning, and that intuitive experimental drive to learn and produce new culture comes out of retaining the play element in culture, then we may conclude that where the drive to learn and create new culture ceases, so too does the play element. This would properly be called a pluralism, a play that has already become culture that then ceases to be play. From the perspective of political pessimism, I find this position stands me in opposition to Huizinga. Huizinga expressed a belief that culture was degrading, yet his examples focused on changes to only the secondary expression of established cultures. Change in culture is the result of play, thus his conclusion of change being the result of the loss of play seems backward. In the same vein, his defining pluralism as appearing like play but without mirth and humor misses the point. It is the appearance of culture without learning nor change. To cling to the old as though it is some kind of objective perfection, to reject and demonize anything that does not fit a narrow mold. If you could indulge me in my own political pessimism, this pluralist attitude is endemic in the rhetoric of conservatism the world over, willfully rejecting the sciences when it denies the established culture, willfully pushing old and defunct science standards that can be used to prevent change. Whatever pseudoscience is most effective at denying the civil rights of minority populations, from phrenology and eugenics to bioessentialism. Of course, not evolution, because that would change the church. Not climate change, because that would change automobiles, ranching, and real estate. Or the rejection of every kind of music invented by African Americans. Blues, jazz, rock and roll, disco, punk, rap, and hip-hop. By attempting to deny the rights to freedom of speech by defining these genres as not music, or, most recently, rejecting the very concept of voting in a Republican system of government, or, most recently, rejecting the very concept of voting in a Republican system of government, the very purpose of a Republican system of government. That very purpose of a Republican system of government is to cause change through voting, rather than stagnating under the nepotism of royalist governments. Scholarship and learning may change the voters, so from a materialist rhetorical perspective, one could prevent change more easily by skipping voting entirely. Having just passed the 2022 midterm election in the United States at the time of writing, in which conservatives across the country ran on a platform of explicitly being election deniers, even going as far as to tell conservative politicians in Brazil to deny the results of their elections as well, despite local and state elections having no connection to or interest in the politics of Brazil. Conservatism denies change. Change comes from learning. Learning comes from play. Nothing could be more of a political pluralism than this. I would most certainly agree with Huizinga if, in his view, he believed that the pluralism of Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the United States came from their attempts to stagnate learning, change, and the spirit of play. Let us now retreat from this line of reasoning for a moment while we settle the final point of Homo Ludens with following the assertion that pluralism does not, in fact, exist. This line of reasoning begins at plainly accepting that the serious and the earnest maintains in play. The magic circle becomes the norm, but it must still be play by inheritance. There is not much need to juxtapose play against any other human activity that may coincide with it. I personally see no utility in juxtaposing play against work as its opposite. Why then would we need a kind of inverse in the form of pluralism? If we are to see play as the fundamental activity that develops into cultural institutions, an idea I have been convinced is true, then from an anthropological and philosophical point of view, I am comfortable with play containing within it the ethical potential to include the serious, the earnest, and yes, even the unethical. With this, we have thoroughly explored the landscape of ideas expressed in Homo Ludens. We lingered on the opportunities for critique and expansion, but it is best to see that as proof that the ideas expressed are worthy of the critique. The historical analysis is more than enough to convince. It is clear why Homo Ludens cemented itself in the foundations of modern ludology. Thank you for listening, and stay true.